Another microevolutionary force is migration. So migration is when organisms are moving between populations. So let me just write that here. And so when individuals migrate, they also carry with them their genetics. Okay, so this moves genes as well. And so a related term is gene flow. So migration of individuals causes gene flow. So when organisms move between populations, they also move their genes. And this can be important when the two populations differ in allele frequencies. Okay, so if the two populations differ in allele frequencies, then they're going to start moving alleles back and forth between the populations and mixing up those genes into the different populations. And so the effect of migration and gene flow is that the two populations become more similar. And this is with regards to allele and genotype frequencies. So we'll take a look at this happening. So imagine we have this deer population, and they have the ability to migrate to either side of this mountain range. So you have two distinct populations because of the mountain range, but a pass is allowing some migration between them. And so there's a difference in coloration, brown versus yellow, or red versus blue alleles. And so as population 2 migrates across the pass, it's bringing blue alleles over to population 1. And as population 1 individuals migrate across, they're bringing over red alleles. So as this exchange keeps happening, they're going to be becoming more and more similar, because what will happen is there will be an increase of red alleles here and an increase of blue alleles here. And so again, over time, you would expect that these allele frequencies between the two populations would become the same. So are these populations in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? And so hopefully you see that this is not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So a reminder that the microevolutionary forces are the opposite of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium conditions. So if migration is happening, then it is not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, because no migration is a condition of Hardy-Weinberg, right? And that's because evolution is occurring here, okay? And more specifically, microevolution is occurring. And that's why we call migration a microevolutionary force. The last microevolutionary force that we will discuss is non-random mating. And this is really commonly confused with sexual selection. Remember that sexual selection is really a variant of natural selection. So in the case of sexual selection, it's when the fitness advantage has to do specifically with reproductive ability. So in the case of non-random mating, we're saying that organisms are choosing their mates based on traits that are not related to mating behavior. So sexual selection is all about mating behaviors and traits, whereas non-random mating is when they're choosing based on traits not related to reproduction. So this is non-random mating is the opposite of a Hardy-Weinberg condition. So again, reminding you that one of the conditions for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is random mating. That is that individuals choose their mates regardless of their genotypes and phenotypes. Okay, so again, for traits that don't have anything to do with mating or mating behaviors. So two types of non-random mating, or two variations, I should say, is assortative or disassortative mating, and inbreeding, which is a really specific type of non-random mating. So we'll take a closer look at those now. So assortative mating is what I like to call like prefers like. So this is when individuals with similar phenotypes are more likely to mate with each other. So I have brown hair. So if I was assortatively mating, then I would only want to mate with individuals with brown hair too. And so this affects the frequencies of genotypes particularly. So this type, assortative mating and disassortative mating, is going to get you a different genotype frequency than you would expect. And when I say expect, this is based on the Hardy-Weinberg equation, right? So the Hardy-Weinberg equation is going to predict a certain genotype frequency. Well, if my population is doing assortative mating, I'm not going to get the frequency that I would expect. And so if I have assortative mating, it's going to alter one of these. So is it the heterozygote or the homozygote? Well, hopefully you can see that if like prefers like, it's going to increase the frequency of homozygotes. So there will be a higher number than you would expect based on the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation. Disassortative mating is what I call opposites attract. So instead of like preferring like, it's like prefers its opposite. So dissimilar phenotypes will mate preferentially. So if I have brown hair, then if I'm doing disassortative mating, I would preferentially mate only with blondes because that's the opposite of me. And so this is also going to affect genotype frequency away from what Hardy-Weinberg would predict. And in this case, it's going to increase heterozygote frequency because you're getting two opposites coming together, two different heterozygote, okay? And again, you'll see that it won't be what 2pq, remember that's from our Hardy-Weinberg equation, we're not going to see that 2pq value. We're going to see a number higher than that if disassortative mating is occurring. So inbreeding is another type of non-random mating where mate choice is based on genetic history. So by genetic history, we mean relatedness. So you're probably most familiar with inbreeding as the idea of like two people who are close relatives having offspring together. So there's been a lot of periods of human history in which this has not been unusual, especially among royalty. Inbreeding has been common. So, if you think about royalty, they have a lot of power and money. And so if they marry outside of their royalty, the other royals, then you're transferring power and wealth to outside your family. So throughout human history, royals have oftentimes married or had offspring with more close relatives than we would consider normal now. So in many cases, siblings or first cousins were particularly likely to marry. And so I have King Tut here, Tutankhamun, who is an Egyptian pharaoh. The marrying of siblings was really common in ancient Egypt. And again, this was because of their maintaining their power and money, but also they had a belief that the pharaohs were actually gods. And so if you're a god, you can only marry another god. And so they were marrying only within their family. And in the case of King Tut, they have done genetic studies of the mummies, so of the remains from King Tut, as well as his parents and some offspring. And so King Tut is actually, his parents were siblings, and his wife, who was also his half-sister. King Tut, they think now had like a birth defect, a clubfoot with really bad bone disease, and they think that may have been caused by the inbreeding in his family. He and his wife had trouble having surviving children, and they think that may have also been to inbreeding. Because what happens with inbreeding is that you get an increase in homozygosity. So it's similar to assortative mating in that respect. And this isn't necessarily a problem. So sometimes we think that, or we heard that, say you had a baby with someone who is related to you, we've heard that there would be something wrong with that baby, or that if two cousins have kids, there'd be something wrong with that baby. In reality, that's not true. People can have offspring with very close relatives and their offspring can be perfectly fine. It just depends on if there's a disease in a recessive or in an allele. Okay, so if there's a disease allele, like say this little a allele causes a disease, if you have an increased homozygosity, when you have inbreeding, you're more likely to get individuals that have the two disease alleles. And so you see diseases tend to increase within families that keep doing inbreeding over long periods of time. So again, over time, you get more and more individuals that have a greater chance of having homozygosity. And I should mention that, this has been happening, like humans have been having offspring with relatively close relatives over long periods of human history. And I like to point out the fact that, humans used to only be able to travel as far as they could walk in a day. So over time, people were always marrying their third or fourth cousin or, fifth cousin or whatever. They weren't necessarily marrying first cousins and usually not siblings. That was pretty rare in human history. But they were marrying distant relatives. And so the more isolated a group was, the more likely they were to be marrying distant cousins. And so you see a certain amount of this increased risk of homozygosity in a lot of isolated cultural groups due to this. So common example is certain groups of people of Jewish descent, for example, have an increased risk of Tay-Sachs disease due to, again, not close inbreeding, not first cousin, but due to their cultural and geographic isolation, they increased this homozygosity due to just marrying like fourth and fifth cousins over time. This can happen in nature. In wild populations, it tends to happen if a population is very small. So in addition to genetic drift, remember we talked about that, but when a population is very small, their only mate could potentially be a first or second cousin. So, if your population went from being this big to being this big, now almost everybody's related to you. And so again, it can increase homozygosity. And that's not a problem unless there's disease alleles. But if there are disease alleles, it will make the disease become more common. And so this is a further challenge in conservation biology when we're dealing with endangered species, because it causes what's called an inbreeding depression. The fitness of the population suddenly drops dramatically because there is this increase in disease alleles and homozygosity. So this is how homozygosity gets increased. So within the family tree, if you have, for example, two cousins having offspring together, those two cousins can both have potentially gotten that disease allele from their shared ancestor. And so as they keep passing down that disease allele, they're more likely to have offspring that have the two disease alleles. If this individual had married outside of their family, then that individual is more likely to not have the disease allele. So as long as this individual married with someone outside their family, they would not have any children that had the disease. All of their children would either be the two dominant alleles or the dominant and recessive. So it's only if the person is marrying within their family, having offspring within their family, that the chance of homozygosity becomes more likely because their family is carrying that disease allele. So that's how non-random mating can change frequency. So again, it's going to alter the frequency from what you would expect. You'll see a higher amount of homozygous genotypes.